Chapter 1, Parts 1 and 2 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Koskinen. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 1. The Beginnings of Greece and the Heroic Age. Section 1. The Origin of the Greeks. Our European civilization had its origin in Greece, and we must date its beginnings to more than 3,000 years ago. We know that in the 13th century B.C. the Greek tongue was spoken throughout the Greek peninsula, and that at the same time, or not much later, Greek minstrels were singing hexameter lays and bringing that marvelous meter to perfection. But when we try to reach further back and to discover whence the Greek-speaking folks came, and how long they had possessed their country, we find little that is certain. In our earliest written record, the Iliad of Homer, the Achaeans appear as the most prominent among the Greek peoples. There are reasons for believing that after the middle of the second millennium, invaders came down from the north, penetrated into the Peloponnesus, and founded or occupied those states which were afterwards glorified in Homeric poems, and that these invaders were the Achaeans. But various opinions may be held as to the significance of this event. It has been supposed that it was in fact the Greek conquest of Greece, that the Achaeans and their fellows were the original people who first spread the Greek tongue over the peninsula, hitherto inhabited by men who spoke no Aryan speech. Or we may hold that men of Greek speech were already in the land, and that the work of the conquerors, whether Greeks themselves or men speaking some other Aryan language, was not to create Greece, but to stimulate her and guide her peoples into new paths. For several reasons it seems probable that the second opinion is true, and that the Achaean invasion is to be compared not to the Anglo-Saxon occupation of Britain, but rather to the Norman conquest. There are no traces of the survival of an older pre-Greek language, and it is difficult to conceive that the conquered population could in a century or two have become, entirely and throughout, Greek like their conquerors. On the other hand, a small body of conquerors entering into possession of a civilization superior to their own might in a short time be assimilated to their subjects. The inhabitants of the hilly uplands of Arcadia boasted that they had lived among their mountains before the birth of the moon. Here there was no Achaean settlements, and if the inhabitants had not been already Greek, Arcadia must have remained, like Wales or Cornwall, a land of alien speech, long after the Achaean conquest. But although we conclude that it had become Greek centuries before the Achaeans appeared on the scene, the Greek peninsula was not always Greek. The original coming of the Greeks was utterly forgotten by their descendants, and we are unable to fix its date. The old home of the invaders is supposed to have lain in the northwest regions of the Balkan peninsula. They must have come southward in such numbers as to extinguish utterly the native speeches which they found in their new country. The men whom the Greeks conquered learned the new tongue and forgot their own, but they had given to many a hill and rock the name which was to abide with it forever. Corinth and Tiryns, Parnassus and Olympus, Arna and Larissa, are names which the Greeks seem to have received from the ancient inhabitants, and some of these names, which are also found in the western parts of Asia Minor, suggest that the primeval people belonged to a race which was diffused on both sides of the Aegean. We shall not perhaps be far astray if we conjecture that the Greeks descended into Greece in the course of the third millennium. Their conquest may have been a gradual infiltration of people after people, rather than the single migration of a vast host, and may have extended over many years. But by 2000 B.C., Zeus, the great Indo-European Lord of Heaven, was probably invoked throughout the length and breadth of the land. The Greeks of history, who had completely forgotten this far distant past, were not exclusively the descendants of these Greek invaders, for it is not to be supposed that the conquered people was abolished or obliterated. The idea that the older inhabitants were entirely crushed out and a clear field left for the newcomers is due to exactly the same kind of false inference from language to race, which makes out Greeks and Romans, Celts and Germans, Slavs and Illyrians, Phrygians and Armenians, Persians and ancient Indians to be the posterity of common Aryan ancestors, because they all spoke kindred tongues. The Greek language is vigorous and masterful, as its subsequent history has shown. It made a complete conquest of the languages of the older inhabitants. In whatever land the Greeks settled, it became exclusively the language of the land. But the extermination of the older tongues does not mean the extermination of the older races. The men among whom the Greeks settled, or whom they conquered, learned the new tongue and forgot their own. There was fusion of the old and the new, and the Indo-European gods of the invaders had to make terms with the deities of the natives. Section 2. Aegean Civilization. Crete. If Greece, as we may fairly believe, was Greek since days to which we cannot reach back, there flourished close to its shores a great non-Greek civilization, which had a decisive influence on its fortunes, and of which we know far more than of the contemporary Greeks. It is only recently that we have become aware of this Aegean civilization, as it is called, which had grown steadily in Crete and in Melos and other islands of the Aegean, from remote beginnings in the Stone Age, until towards the end of the third millennium Crete entered upon a period of power and brilliancy which rivals in interest the more famous civilizations of Egypt and Babylon. The monuments which reveal the great age of Crete have been dug out of the earth, and although Greek tradition remembered that Crete was once a strong sea power, no one suspected that this island had been the home of a life and art highly developed and various, and the center of a culture which spread far over the Mediterranean Sea. In the course of the third millennium, Crete had passed from the age of stone into the age of metal. The remains of a homogeneous culture have been found all over the island, but the leading settlements, the seats of the most powerful rulers, were Knossos and Phaistos. Nearly at the middle of the north coast, the hill of Knossos is situated a few miles from the sea, close to the banks of a stream, Kairos. Before 2100 B.C., a great palace was erected on this hill, and at Phaistos, in the south of the island, a palatial residence arose much about the same time. These palaces endured for several centuries, and in this period the development of Cretan art was marked by the perfection of polychrome (many-colored) pottery. We have some beautiful examples of what Cretan artists could do, such as a fresco picture of a little boy, who is painted in blue, picking white crocuses, and placing them in a vase. The most interesting and important fact about the civilization of the Cretans is that they could write. We find first a method of picture writing, in which each pictorial symbol, such as an ox head, or a gate, or an eye, represented a word. But at a later period there was likewise used a system of linear signs, of which each probably stood for a syllable. A table of drink offerings, inscribed with signs of this kind, was found in the cave of Mount Dicta, already a holy place, and afterwards to be associated with the birth of Zeus. We have no clue to the language of these documents. It seems unlikely that it was Indo-European. It seems most likely that it was cognate with the tongues of the Lycians and other ancient peoples of western Asia Minor. In eastern Crete a strange language was still spoken in late times, when the rest of the island had become Greek. We have some slight records of it which can be read, but cannot be interpreted. And it would be natural to suppose that this was the same language which prevailed in the pre-Hellenic period. It was towards the year 1600 B.C. that the end of this period of Cretan history was marked by the partial destruction of the palace of Knossos. Everything points to the conclusion that this was the consequence of a revolution within the island, and not of foreign invasion. Perhaps there was war between Knossos and Phaestus. At all events, the early palace of Phaestus seems to have survived the early palace of Knossos. But a new dynasty was soon to take possession of the Cnossian hill, to develop further the native civilization, and inaugurate a still more brilliant period in the island's history. Aegean civilization attained its highest bloom in Crete, but it had developed independently in the islands of the archipelago, especially in Melos, where its continuous growth can be traced in the important settlement of Philakopi. Melos produces obsidian, which in the Stone Age and later was in great request for the manufacture of knives and spear points, and her export of this product, which was taken for instance to Egypt, may explain her early prosperity. Remains have been found which show that the eastern coast of Greece was not unaffected by this insular civilization. We have still to glance at a great stronghold which towards the end of the third millennium stood on the hill of Troy, commanding the entrance of the Hellespont. It was not the first city that had been reared on that illustrious hill, which rises to the height of about 160 feet, not far from the banks of the Scamander. The earliest settlement, fortified by a rude wall of unwrought stone, can still be traced, and some of its primitive earthenware and stone implements have been found. An axe head of white nephrite seems to show that in those remote days there was a line of traffic, however slow and uncertain, between the Mediterranean and the Far East, for this white jade must have come from Central Asia. On the ruins of this primeval city arose a great fortress, girt with a wall of sun-baked brick, built on strong stone foundations. There were 3 gates, and the angles of the walls were protected by towers. The inhabitants of this city lived in the Stone and Copper Age. Bronze was still a rarity. Their pottery was chiefly handmade, but a treasure of golden ornaments, wrought by skilful craftsmen, shows that the palace was wealthy. The most important feature to be noted is the outline of the palace in this ancient city. Here, at the very outset of Aegean civilization, we find the general plan of the main part of the house exactly the same as that which is described, more than 1,000 years later, in the poems of Homer. From an outer gate we pass through a courtyard, in which an altar stood, into a square preliminary chamber, and from it we enter the great hall, in the centre of which was the hearth. An enemy's hand destroyed the castle by fire, and no tradition of its existence has survived. When we come down 7 or 8 centuries to the famous city of which it was the precursor, we shall learn the probable secret of the prosperity of its kings. It may be asked how, without the guidance of literary records, we can fix the successive stages of Aegean civilization in an ordered series, and assign approximate dates to its periods. When we have started with the capital division of time, between the Age of Stone and the Age of Bronze, the potter's art is the chief clue for establishing a relative chronology within each of these ages. The clay vessels, from the most simple and primitive molded by hand, to the most artistic and elaborate wrought by wheel, can be arranged in a definite series, and thus the things which are found in the same stratum as a particular class of sherds can be assigned to a definite place in this succession. Such things, found in association with particular stages in the development of pottery, may then become themselves additional criteria for dating remains. The history of Cretan civilization from the end of the Stone Age has by this means been arranged in three chief ages, called Early, Middle, and Late Minoan, and each of these has been subdivided into three periods. It is to the intercourse of Crete with Egypt that we are indebted for the means of determining roughly the absolute dates of its history, or, in other words, of correlating its chronology with the general chronology of the world. Thus, a polychrome Cretan vessel found in the tomb of King Senusert III, Sesostris, at Egyptian Abydos enables us to conclude that the second period of the Middle Minoan Age was approaching its close about B.C. 1880. Again, the statuette of an Egyptian in diorite stone, inscribed with his name in Egyptian characters, was found in a court of the Cnossian Palace, and its style makes it probable that it was wrought under the 12th or 13th dynasty, perhaps in the second half of the 19th century B.C. It was probably about 1600 B.C. that kings, perhaps of a new dynasty but not of a new race, began to rule on the hill of Knossos. The palace had been rebuilt on a grander scale, and adapted to more sumptuous needs, though there was no change in the general architectural style, and about 1500 B.C. it seems to have been extensively remodeled. It covered an area of about 5 acres. It was not fortified by an exterior wall. Its lords seem to have trusted to their ships for defense against foreign invaders. To the east and to the west of a great central court were extensive labyrinths of rooms and passages, and the remains of staircases show that in some parts the building rose to the height of 3 or 4 stories. The principal halls were lit at one end by open shafts or light wells, walled in on 3 sides, and on the 4th open to the hall from which they were separated by 2 or 3 columns. There were bathrooms, and there was an excellent system of drainage by pipes, superior perhaps to any of the contrivances that have been since in use till quite recent times. If the palace had merely served as the habitation of the royal household, it need not have been so large. But it was much more. It was the seat of a government which controlled not merely the neighboring regions or even the island, but a maritime empire. The administration of this empire was conducted on careful business lines, as is shown by the financial documents found in the archives. We may fairly surmise that there existed a well-developed system of administrative machinery which needed considerable room for its offices. The rich tributes which the kings derived from their dependencies were stored in the palace, and various industries were carried on within its walls for the private needs of the monarch, and also probably for purposes of commerce. The discovery of an olive press and great jars for oil storage suggests that not only did the palace supply itself with the oil required for its cooking and its lamp fuel, but that the king himself may have traded in oil, which seems at this time to have been one of the principal Cretan exports. Then there was accommodation for the sculptors and painters who were employed in the royal service. There is evidence that the paints were manufactured on the spot, and a sculptor's workshop has been discovered. One of the most notable rooms in this spacious palace was the chamber of the throne, entered through an anteroom from the central court. The throne is a stone seat adorned with a painted design, and on either side are benches along the wall. Here the king may have sat in council with his ministers. Adjoining this apartment was a room open to the air, containing a tank, and its walls showed a picture of Egyptian character, a landscape with river, sedge, and palms. Most of the principal chambers and corridors were decorated with fresco paintings, representing solemn processions, gay groups of men and women, scenes of town life, less often of war. The fashions of the time are vividly portrayed in a series of miniature frescoes, showing us women, idling in courts or on balconies, with their hair elaborately dressed, wearing costumes which look as if they had been modelled on quite modern fashions: puffed sleeves, flounced skirts, bodices tightly drawn in round the waist. One of the most striking pictures which have survived is that of a tall, handsome cup-bearer, evidently belonging to the same race as the Cretans, Kefteu, who are represented in a painting of Egyptian Thebes as bringing offerings to King Thothmes III in the 15th century. Near the northern entrance to their palace the later lords of Knossos constructed a theatre capable of holding about 400 spectators. This was not a new thing. A theatre of an earlier period has been discovered in the palace of Phaestus. The orchestral area in these early theatres was not circular, as in those of later times, but rectangular, and the performances were probably religious dances in honor of the great Cretan goddess, and perhaps boxing matches. The space was not large enough for bullfights, which seem to have been a favorite amusement of the Cretans, if we may judge from scenes depicted on wall paintings and gems, which present acrobats grappling with bulls. Women took part in this dangerous sport. In one painting we see a girl in the air caught on the horns of a bull. The kings had also quieter recreations. A magnificent inlaid gaming board of very beautiful design was found in the palace, made of pieces of ivory overlaid with gold foil, and crystals coloured alternately blue and white by means of blue paste, kyanos, and silver foil, on which they were set. Beneath the great palace, close to the river bank and about 130 yards east of the northern entrance gate, was a smaller palace which, it has been conjectured, may have been used by the king as a summer retreat. On its smaller scale it seems to have been as sumptuous as the greater dwelling. Here was found, fallen from a room on an upper story, a superb painted jar, showing the highest point to which the art of the Cnossian potters could attain in the 16th century. The decoration, displaying sprays of papyrus and rosettes, is effected by the combination of colour and relief. Here, too, there was a throne room, a remarkable pillared hall, more than 12 yards long, resembling in its arrangement the Roman basilica or law court. The rebuilding of the palace of Phaestus fell perhaps in the 16th century. Like that of Knossos, it was unfortified, and it was built on a very similar plan, and in the same fashion of architecture. Here, too, there was a large court in the centre, surrounded by pillared reception halls and storerooms, and a smaller court in the west of the building. The residence of Phaestus was distinguished by an imposing entrance, with a flight of 12 steps, 45 feet broad, and though it was much smaller in extent than the rival palace of Knossos, and its walls were not adorned with such rich and various paintings, its external appearance seems to have been more imposing, for it was built upon the slope of a hill, and rose, roof above roof, on different levels. About 2 miles off, at a place now called Hagia Triada, a well-built house has been found which seems to have served as a pleasure residence for the potentates of the neighbouring palace. Not far from the palace of Knossos there must have been a populous town. Whole Cretan towns have been excavated in eastern Crete, and much has been found to illustrate the town life of the common people and the artisans. For instance, the house of a carpenter, with all his tools, his chisels, saws, awls, and nails. But of the appearance of a flourishing town, such as Knossos must have been, we can better gain an idea from the facades of private houses, which are represented on mosaic plaques of porcelain discovered in the palace. The houses were of several stories. Some had 2 doors, others 1. The windows above might have 4 or 6 panes, and there seemed to be unwindowed openings in the upper stories, which might serve the purposes of balconies. These Cretan houses show considerable likeness to contemporary houses in Egypt. There seems to be no evidence that there were public temples in Crete at this period. There were sanctuaries in the palaces, and perhaps the Cretans generally performed their religious duties in domestic shrines. The chief divinity whom they worshipped was a nature goddess, the goddess whom the Greeks called Rhea, and this indeed may have been her Cretan name. Scenes of worship were frequently depicted in art. The goddess is represented sometimes guarded by lions, sometimes associated with doves who were symbolic of the descent of a deity. She was served by priestesses. She was closely connected with a male divinity, whether her consort or her son, who seems to have been subordinate to her. In later times the Greeks conceived this god as Zeus, son of Rhea, and nurtured in the Idaean cave. Both the goddess and the god were associated with the double axe, a fetish in which the deity was supposed to dwell. We find the same worship of the double axe in Western Asia Minor among the Carians. This symbol was so frequently represented on the walls of the Cnossian palace that it might almost be called the Palace of the Double Axe, and as the Carian name for the double axe was Labris, it has been suggested that the palace was known as the Labyrinthos. This would explain the origin of the curious Greek legend that Minos, king of Knossos, kept in a labyrinth the monstrous Minotaur, who devoured the tribute of youths and virgins brought from overseas. The intricate plan of the palace might well suggest a maze. We have seen that the art of writing was long familiar to the Cretans. In this later period a new and more advanced system of linear signs was in use. The kings kept accurate records and accounts. Hundreds of written documents have been found in the Cnossian palace, consisting of small rectangular tablets of clay, which were preserved in wooden boxes secured by seals. As we have no clue to the language, they cannot be read, but the numerical symbols can be identified. The arithmetical system was decimal, and there were signs for fractions. It has been inferred from the frequent occurrence of numerals, and from the insertion of figures representing objects, that many of the documents are accounts relating to the stores. The Cretans possessed a system of weights, and here they seem to have been indebted, through whatever intermediate channel, to the kingdom of Babylonia, for their standard was derived from what is known as the light Babylonian talent. And they had a metal currency. Pieces of gold and silver and bronze ingots have been found, which can only have been used for the purpose of exchange. The power and splendor of the kings of Knossos were at their height in the 15th century. These kings were undoubtedly the richest and most powerful in Crete, and it is not improbable that they now exercised overlordship over the rulers of Phaestus and over the other towns of the island, in many of which striking remains of Aegean civilization have been unearthed. Their fleets controlled the Aegean Sea. They dominated the islands, and their civilization spread, as we shall see, to the mainland of Greece. But Cretan influence radiated to more distant shores, by trade and even by colonization. The commercial intercourse with Egypt, which had existed from primitive times, became probably more regular and frequent. Oil and pottery were exported to the lands of the Nile. The kings of the country of the Keftiu and the isles of the Great Sea brought offerings to the great monarchs of the 18th dynasty, and the influence of Egypt can be traced in the Cretan culture of the time. The Philistines, who settled in southern Palestine, are now supposed to have been colonists from Crete, and remains found in Sicily and Spain testify that the island of Minos sent products and offshoots of its civilization far to the west. The later Greeks associated the Cretan supremacy in the Aegean with the name of the great sea lord Minos. The most ancient tradition seems to have known two kings of this name, of whom one reigned towards the end of the 15th century, and the other about 200 years later. The earlier was confused and blended with the later figure, and in consequence of this confusion, the false belief arose that the Cretan thalassocracy was at its height towards the close of the 13th century. End of Chapter 1, Part 2.